A dam built by Ethiopia on the largest tributary of the Nile River has set off a global fight over water. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has set off a three-country dispute over the rights to the Nile River's water.
Welcome to episode 24 of Tahrir Podcast and the first in-person audiovisual episode. Make sure you're tuning in via YouTube or Spotify if you'd like to see the guests and I in person. So in 2011, Ethiopia began constructing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, mostly referred to as the GERD or the GERD. Ever since, Nile Basin countries, namely Egypt and Sudan, have been trying to negotiate with the Ethiopian government. And negotiations have reached a deadlock, with Sudan as recent as the 28th of January of 2023, 3 days ago, vaguely and publicly making it clear that they have no objections to Ethiopia's dam. For Egypt, however, it poses an existential threat. For the Nile provides 93% of its water resources. And Egypt insists that the dam be filled once a legally binding agreement is reached. The dam is set to finish construction later this year, 2023, and to accordingly finish filling by then. And no agreement has yet been reached. My guest today is Dr. Salzberg, with a long history in diplomacy and numerous awards and distinctions from various institutions, including MIT, the Naval Center for Space Science and Technology, and the U.S. State Department. Dr. Salzberg served as the State Department's first special coordinator for water, where he led the development and implementation of U.S. foreign policy on water and sanitation, water resources and management, and transboundary water and conflict. And he now directs the Water Institute and is a distinguished Holzworth professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the University of North Carolina. Welcome.
Nice to meet you. This is great.
So first of all, it's nice to finally have you on the podcast after having met briefly last year, or just rather 2 months ago.
No, I'm happy to be able to contribute. It's an important issue.
Definitely, indeed. So first, would you mind elaborating on your previous role at the State Department?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I managed international water issues for the United States, and so I was actively engaged on a whole range of issues from what initiatives governments might want to advance within the UN system and how the UN system works on water, everything from the G7 to other international agreements, as well as the transboundary water, and working to see what the United States could do to help promote cooperation on transboundary water in many places around the world. The Nile was just one of those places, but we had initiatives to work with countries across from the Mekong all the way through Central Asia into Africa. And so transboundary water was something that was near and dear to my heart. When I left graduate school, I was very interested in conflict resolution work, and these are really complicated issues, and so I was really attracted to seeing what we could do to resolve conflicts over water.
And so the GERD's construction began in 2011. So what happened before? Were there talks about building it in the first place? How was that?
About the dam and about cooperation on the Nile. These things have been going on for a long, long time. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me to know that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there were conversations around some of these issues going on in the region. The dam itself, there was a lot of work done by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation in the region to actually survey the Blue Nile and to see what potential dam sites might be there and might be readily developed to produce power and provide water for other purposes. And so there were things going on dating well before the 1950s about the development of the Blue Nile. But there's a long history of dam development along the entire Nile. These are issues that have been talked about for well over a century. And there have been a number of efforts to advance cooperation and cooperative development of the Blue Nile for the benefit of all the countries. And in fact, in 2000, a number of countries worked together to help launch the Nile Basin Initiative, which really was an effort to help promote a cooperative solution to managing the water resources of the Nile for the benefit of all the countries.
Can you tell me more about the Nile Basin Initiative?
Yeah, there were really two parts to it. So this was supported by at that point, I think there were 9 riparian countries. Eritrea was not part of the Nile Basin Initiative. And there were a number of donors led by the World Bank, but there were many other donor countries that were very active in supporting the efforts of the Nile Basin Initiative. It was really an effort to help build the capacity of the countries themselves to address some of the challenges that we saw around water. And there were two parts to that. One was this capacity building element. Could we strengthen each individual government's capability as well as the collective capability of all the governments to understand, monitor, manage, and develop their water resources and develop bankable projects and programs that could be invested in by outside stakeholders to help develop those water resources. There was another part to the Nile Basin Initiative, which was developing a joint legal framework that would provide the basis for cooperation between the countries. And those two tracks were developed over the course of, the last 2 decades now. And the capacity building element, there were millions and millions of dollars that were mobilized through projects and programs that were developed through that track. So that was a reasonably successful track, and it continues on today. And on the legal framework, that ran into an impasse in 2010. And that's when there were a number of issues with the draft document that the countries were proposing that Egypt and Sudan had objected to, and this kind of led to another kind of a stalemate over water within the region.
And where does the GERD come in?
Yeah, so the GERD came in 2010, and to be frank, it was a little bit of a surprise to everyone because there was a process going on within the Nile Basin Initiative centered on the Blue Nile, where Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan were sitting down together to look at potential development plans for the Blue Nile with the support of potential donor partners. And this particular dam was not part of those conversations. And so I think everyone was a little bit surprised when it was announced that this dam was going to go ahead and be built. That was certainly a point of concern and contention among all the countries.
And how involved are you in that process of negotiating a solution?
Well, so at the time, there weren't really any negotiations going on specifically related to the dam. There were lots of conversations going on between the countries around this cooperative development framework, legal framework that they were hoping to put in place, but nothing related to the dam. At that point, when the dam was announced and we recognized that this was a point of contention between the countries, we started to suggest a number of different options that the countries might pursue to help promote a more constructive dialogue process between them. And so we threw out a number of ideas, but the countries themselves decided to establish this independent panel of experts to help review the design plans for the dam and make sure that the dam itself was going to deliver the benefits and that they were talking about. And if there were any major problems that were identified, that hopefully those problems could be addressed.
And what has that led to?
So that process finished in about a year and a half, and there were a number of challenges.
2013?
About then, and there were a number of challenges with that. The process wasn't informed by all the information. They didn't at that point. They didn't have all the details about what the dam would look like, how it would be operated, and everything else. There were still some concerns and questions raised about what the impacts the dam might have downstream. And so they actually recommended that there were some additional studies that should happen to better allow the countries to understand what these downstream impacts might be. And those studies were never completed.
And why do you think no deal has yet been reached? It's been almost more than a decade.
Yeah, this is a complicated question, and there's a lot of history behind it, I think. If you were to look at right now, what are the key issues that might be preventing them from reaching an agreement? There's probably three, and I'm not involved in the discussions right now, and things may have changed a little bit, but I would suspect that there's probably three main issues right now. One relates to you're building the dam, and the dam has the capability to store water, but it releases that water downstream. One question would be around, should Ethiopia be allowed to use water trapped behind the dam or upstream of that dam for other purposes? In other words, can they start extracting water from that system that would reduce the flows of water to the downstream countries? And so that's one issue that I think is still an outstanding concern between the countries. The second issue is what happens if there's a major drought? And I think under normal circumstances, there's a lot of work that's been done to show that the dam could provide significant benefits to all three countries if it were properly operated. I think the challenge comes if you run into a drought for, let's say, 5 years, and the reservoir levels behind the dam start to drop. And then it starts to rain again. But at that point, it's been 5 years, that reservoir is low, reservoirs within Sudan are low, Aswan is low, and Egypt and Sudan have been suffering from low agricultural production over the last 4 or 5 years because of the drought. Who gets that water first? Can Ethiopia, when it rains again, impound that water to refill the dam so they can produce the power that they need to produce? Or should that water get passed downstream to alleviate the pressure on Sudan and Ethiopia, who've also been experiencing the drought? And so there's a real question about how you distribute the costs and benefits of the dam and the dam operation if there's a long-term drought. And that's, I suspect, a real sticking point between the countries, right? Should Ethiopia have priority to produce energy for its people? Or should Sudan or Egypt have priority in order to maintain agricultural production and feed their people? Real trade-offs and very legitimate trade-offs between these countries that have to be resolved. That's probably the second major issue that needs to be discussed. The third issue that still might be an impediment between the countries is enforcement. So let's say they do reach an agreement, and it's got all sorts of terms in it and conditions and everything else. What happens if a country doesn't live up to the terms and conditions of that agreement? And some of the initial discussions that the countries have had between themselves, that Ethiopia has been very steadfast in saying, the government should have the final say in what happens. Egypt has suggested that maybe an external partner, maybe the World Bank, maybe the UN, somebody should adjudicate, if there's a difference between the parties that can't be resolved, should adjudicate that dispute. And that's a real challenge. What do you do if the countries can't reach an agreement? And who's the final arbiter of a dispute that might arise between the parties over the implementation of that agreement? And so that's probably another major impediment to reaching an agreement right now. Now, all that being said, that's just the water-related impediments. Because remember, we've got a dam in the Horn of Africa that's impacting a number of countries, and there's a lot of relationships going on between these countries. And it's quite possible that the broader geopolitical set of relations between these countries is an impediment to getting an agreement on this dam. And so it may be that absent a broader set of cooperative agreements between Egypt and Ethiopia, or Sudan and Ethiopia, or even between Sudan and Egypt, for that matter, because Egypt does need to have a good water relationship with Sudan. That's critically important. Absent all those, it might be very difficult to reach an agreement over the dam. There's also a big domestic political issue. Can any of these countries be seen as agreeing to a dam that doesn't necessarily meet their own interests, right? Could the president survive if he agreed to what some people believe would be giving away the rights of the Nile, right? That would be a very hard thing to compromising Egypt's water security. If the government is seen as compromising their own water security, that has some political risks internally, and that's something you couldn't necessarily agree to. So it may be internal domestic pressure, both in Egypt, but even in Ethiopia, might be preventing the countries from coming into an agreement as well. So there's lots of things going on that could prevent an agreement from happening.
I disagree with one part of what you said, which is the political consequences, specifically in Egypt, because I think that's no longer a problem for the current regime or the current president,
right?
Because there's no space to begin with. There's literally no space through which you could even express your anger,
right?
So I don't think that's something they would really be worrying about, even though it still might be something that's
Right.
on their list of worries.
I agree, and that's obviously a serious problem. But I suspect that no Egyptian government wants to be seen as the government that gave away the Nile. Whether that's true or not in the text of the agreement, if it's perceived that way, that's a real problem to overcome. And that's a legacy that will last for generations, probably.
Yeah, I agree. And you were talking about Sudan
Yeah.
shortly. Before starting recording, we'll talk about Sudan now, how that's going to be the bigger problem
Right.
for Egypt, not
Right.
Ethiopia, but Sudan. So could you
Right.
maybe elaborate on that further?
Yeah.
Also,
Sorry, go ahead.
I feel like it's worthy to keep in mind that the coup d'etat, the military coup that happened in Sudan,
Right.
it was backed by Egypt, as far as I know, and it actually broadcast as the Minister of Defense was in Cairo, as far as I remember. So I feel like, yeah, it gets quite confusing sometimes.
It does get quite confusing, right? And I guess if the assumption was that Egypt and the new government in Sudan were quite comfortable with each other, then why would Sudan reach an agreement with Ethiopia without some sort of conversation with Egypt, and all three announcing it? And really, that's the problem, right? I mean, at the end of the day, and I had these conversations with Haile Mariam when he was prime minister in Ethiopia. I said, at the end of the day, what you really want to do is the day you start producing power, you want to be up there with the president of Egypt, you want to be up there with the president of Sudan, you all want to be up there on the dam cutting the ribbon together. That's the ideal situation. That's where you want to go, and that's where you want to head. And that was the vision that I had, and that was the vision I think we were trying to work towards, but we didn't get there.
What was her response?
I think it was complicated at that time. At that time, I think, and this is very early on, 2010 to 2013, during that time frame, I think it was clear that Egypt didn't want to see this dam be built. And that was a very firm position. And so Ethiopia responded in kind to that, which is, you know what, we're going to go ahead and build this dam. And that set up a lot of this tension that exists between the parties. I think Egypt's position has changed since then. And I think Egypt has come to terms with the fact that the dam could bring great benefits, and it's an important thing for Egypt. And they've said this multiple times. Prime Minister Shokri said this multiple times, right? They want to make sure that they can support Ethiopian development, and the dam could be a key part of that. And so I think their views changed on it. But early on, I think there was this animosity that was much more palpable between the countries, and it was a real problem.
And by saying that there could be benefits for Egypt,
Yeah.
I still struggle to understand that, because Egypt is already water scarce.
Yeah.
And from, as far as I know, if the dam keeps filling up, and even with no drought, our share of water, of Nile water, would already start going down, which already started impacting agriculture.
Right.
So where exactly do you see the benefits for Egypt?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So theoretically, dams are going to be important going forward in the future, in part because climate change is going to increase the variability of water. So we're going to see more extreme precipitation events, which means a lot of rain falling at one time and then lots of time where there's no rain falling. And so you need infrastructure to capture that rain and store it. Ideally, you don't want to store that in a desert. The evaporative losses are really, really high. And this is the challenge with the Aswan Dam. There's a lot of evaporative losses from that dam. If you can store that water up in the Ethiopian highlands and then release it when you need it, you could reduce the evaporative losses and theoretically increase the amount of water that's available to Egypt and Sudan.
I feel like that proposes another dilemma for Ethiopia, because then would they rather generate electricity or use the water for their own agriculture, or would they rather give it up to Egypt and Sudan, right?
Well, the good news is to generate power, they have to release the water. So, they can hold the water all they want, but somehow at the end of the day, if they want to generate power, they've got to release the water downstream. And so Sudan and Egypt will get the water. Now, what the timing is of those releases is important. And certainly Ethiopia should be talking to Sudan and Egypt about the timing of those releases. But it may be, look, if the Aswan Dam is high, Egypt could say to Ethiopia, look, store water That's fine, do it, because we may call on that later, and if you release it, and that's the type of cooperative framework that you want to see. Now, the point about Ethiopia withdrawing water for, let's say, agricultural purposes, that could be a challenge. The reality is, I think there's that possibility around the dam site in particular is probably not that great. There really isn't a lot of arable land, so to speak, right around the dam site. Now, Sudan is really poised to develop its agricultural sector, and they have the potential to use water for agricultural purpose to a much higher degree than I think Ethiopia does at the current time. And so that's where I think that the real conversation for Egypt about how does Egypt protect its water security, and there's got to be a lot of different elements to that, but a key element to that is how do they work with Sudan to collectively manage the water that's coming into Sudan for the benefit of both those two countries. Ethiopia, again, you'd like to see Ethiopia operate the dam in such a way that it benefits the two downstream countries. At a bare minimum, it's going to release it. That shouldn't be a problem unless A, their extractions upstream become really large, or B, there's a long-term drought, and again, it gets to that point where everybody's been suffering, and that first drop of water comes. Who gets that first drop of water? Who gets priority?
And so there's this question that's been that goes back as far as 1978, when former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat threatened Ethiopia with basically the quote military solution in case they even think about building such dam or anything on the Nile, where the Nile starts flowing. So the question is a military solution even feasible or even possible at this point, given that the dam already completed its third filling? Is that even possible?
Yeah, really tough. So it depends on what you call a military solution, right? So usually in these kinds of scenarios, countries have four options. If you're a downstream country and you've got an upstream country that's doing something that you oppose, you can engage diplomatically, right? You try to negotiate a solution directly with that country, and Egypt is certainly trying to do that through a number of different structures. They've engaged directly. They've asked the United States to be part of that, the World Bank at different times, other members of the GCC, a lot of different methods have been tried to do that. You can engage politically. In other words, let's say the parties you've got one party that won't come to an agreement. Can you put external pressure on them by going to the UN or some other process where you can put political pressure on them to agree? The third option is covert. You can engage in covert activities, and we've seen this in other cases where governments have sent in viruses to impact software that's impacted the operations of certain structures and things like that. You can engage kinetically, which is a formal military engagement. That's a really hard one in this particular case for maybe three reasons. I think, one, dams are really big structures, right? And they're these big blocks of concrete. It would take a lot to take out a dam. And so you'd have to, how you even get ordnance of that size to that location could be a problem, a logistical challenge of how you get the right planes in the right places with the right weaponry to go in and take a dam out. The other is what happens if you take out the dam. There's a lot of water behind it now, and that water is likely to impact Sudan in negative ways, and that would certainly have repercussions for Egypt. And so you've got to be really careful then about the physical impact that an attack like that might have. And then the third is the political impact that an attack like that will have. And I suspect that this would be seen as not just an attack on Ethiopia, but perhaps an attack on Africa. And that might mobilize a greater response than anybody would be prepared for. And you'd certainly hate to see this escalate into a broader conflict, either within the Horn or more broadly within Africa.
Well, what if that's the only solution? What if there's and it's just you?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure it is the solution. I think at this point there are other solutions that I think Egypt has to pursue that are not military. I mean, I think you have to continue to be diplomatic about it. And also, look, it's not clear yet that we have a problem.
So far?
Right. And one potential outcome of this process is that no agreement happens, and we start entering into this period where the dam is full. Ethiopia starts to manage the dam, and if we're lucky, Ethiopia might be more transparent about how the dam. And look, we're all going to be able to see how the dam is getting managed. We're going to be, the new, the United States, UK, Canada, France recently launched the Surface Water and Ocean Topography Mission. It's a new satellite that's going up. That satellite's going to be able to see how much water is behind that reservoir, the elevation of that water in the reservoir. And so the whole world's going to know how much water is back there. We're going to be able to know how much water is getting released. We're going to know how much water, therefore, is being used in other purposes. So it's going to be highly modeled and looked at. We're all going to know what's going on. Sorry, go ahead. You had a question.
Yeah. Could you maybe elaborate on that new satellite? When is it set to launch?
Yeah, so it launched in last month, just recently. Probably be about another 6 months before it fully comes online, and we can start getting all the data on board and doing all the things that we want to. But you can measure the elevation, so that's the height of the water, down to about 10 centimeters on any body of water that's about 100 meters in size. So maybe even a large Olympic-sized swimming pool, you'll be able to see from space how much water is in it, right? So, yeah.
Also, for context, Ethiopia has been putting up numbers that are not really. I don't recall exactly where I came across this, but I recall coming across an article or something discussing that they gave out numbers that are incorrect regarding the level of filling that they had.
That may be true. Some of that, I can't say if that's intentional or not. What I will say is that this is an imperfect process, and as they're building up the dam, the amount of water that gets impounded behind the dam is dependent on the height of the dam at the time that it's raining and the season, everything else, how much water might be passing through some of the gates and things like that. And so it's possible that the reservoir. Does it really matter? Again, I'm not so sure. And that gets to we were just talking about the idea of, is this really a problem right now? And it, fortunately, and we've been pretty lucky that the hydrology has been reasonably normal or above average. And so filling the dam has been okay. And we might be able to make our way through it. And the hope is that as we see climate change a little bit more, that there'll be greater precipitation in that region. So that's a plus as well. So hopefully there'll be more water coming down the system. Obviously, the increase in temperatures down in Egypt and Sudan are going to be a real threat, and that's a real problem. But in terms of the water coming down the system, hopefully we've got enough water. Let's say 5 years, each year Ethiopia starts to manage the dam. They get better at it. The downstream countries better understand how the dam is being managed. And everybody says, okay, we can make this work. If there's a significant problem that comes up, then the hope is that the countries can sit down and talk about it, and that we'll see some willingness by Ethiopia to say, okay, we can manage the dam a bit differently over the next 4 or 5 months to help make sure that this problem is avoided. And if that kind of stuff starts to happen, then I think what we'll end up doing is just kind of falling into an agreement where we don't have anything formally written down on a piece of paper, but there's a way of working with each other that we begin to establish that the countries begin to get comfortable with. Now, does that mean that Egypt's long-term water security rights are guaranteed? Probably not. And I know that that's the main challenge, right? And I get it. Right, and this is, I've had to explain. A lot of people have said, but why does Egypt need this, and why can't Egypt agree? What's the number? How much water does Egypt really need? And often the way I explain this is, it's like retiring, right? You reach a certain age and you want to retire. How much money do you need in the bank before you can retire? And when you think about it, I'm not sure. If I were healthy, and if I were and I knew I was going to live for 20 years, and I was going to die at the end of 20 years, and I could do the math, and I could figure out exactly how much money I would need for 20 years, and I know how much I would need in the bank, right? But what if I get sick? What if I get cancer? What if I need to spend money for this? What if I've got a kid who wants to do this? What if that changes? Or what if I live for 40 years? All of a sudden, I needed a lot more money in the bank. And so Egypt is in this very difficult position of trying to say how much water is enough when you just don't know. That's a really challenging position for the downstream countries to be in. And so, look, this is a real hard issue. And this is why I'd say that, as the dam starts to begin operations and we start to see how Ethiopia is going to do this with the other countries, Egypt needs to work towards its own water security in lots of different ways. And they need to work with Sudan to better manage and reduce losses in Sudan so that there's more water that's flowing to Egypt.
Is there something else Egypt could put more energy in besides the Nile?
Yeah, for sure.
To make up.
Look, overall, you want to do a couple of things, right? You want to reduce your consumption of water, and so can you improve the way you do agriculture? Agriculture is probably the largest consumer of water in most countries, and so the idea of you move to irrigation, drip irrigation, more advanced systems, so you use less water to produce the same amount of crops, that becomes really important. You move away from being an agrarian economy. And I know that's going to be tough, right? Because you got a lot of jobs that depend on that. But the fact is, under almost any scenario, it's going to get more difficult to grow food in Egypt, at least through traditional methods, right? In other words, getting a plot of land, watering that land, and growing food is going to become increasingly difficult as the climate begins to change. And so Egypt's going to have to rely on other mechanisms to meet its food security interests. And that will in turn help meet reduce their water demands. And that's going to be important. So establishing relations that allow them to trade for food, developing other sectors of their economy that generate revenue and economy and jobs that allow them then to purchase food from other sources, incredibly important. Reducing consumption, so using less water I remember, and this is not to level blame, but I remember being in Cairo and watching people wash their sidewalks with a hose. That's probably not the right use of water at this point in time, right? And so more conservation efforts, both at home, around in the country, and in other places. I think that's going to be important. Finding ways to work with Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia to reduce evaporative losses. Again, if you've got some assurance that you don't need to keep the Aswan Dam as high as it is and lose as much vapor, that's important. You want to reuse water. Use it as many times as you can. And so the idea of recovering wastewater, and that can be a challenge in certain countries. I know that there's concerns about using wastewater in Islamic countries, but it's happening. Jordan is doing it and doing it very effectively. Other places can do it. You can use it for certain kinds of crops and do it safely. And so water reuse is an important part of this. Water recycling in it is an important part of that. And then augment supplies. You may be able to, you've got the Nubian aquifer, so you've got groundwater that you can use temporarily. It's a fossil aquifer, so it's not recharged. And sorry, what that means is that, you've got some underground reservoirs of water that fill up when it rains, so to speak, over a long period of time. And then you get some that will never fill up, that you only have that amount of water. And the aquifer that Egypt has is one of those latter ones. It's fixed. So once you use it up, it's gone. So you don't want to use it all up. You want to be thoughtful about it. But it gives you a transition period where you can use some of that water as you work through some of these other steps to augment supplies. And so desalinization of seawater, it might be an option, not really for the agriculture sector, right? You don't want to do large-scale desal for agricultural purposes. It probably isn't cost efficient, but to meet domestic needs, you can use desal. By and large, you want to switch to growing salt-tolerant crops. So there are some crops that are genetically modified now to grow in salt water and brackish water, so you can begin to do that as well. All these things probably have to happen to make Egypt more water secure, but you got to move away from a water-intensive economy.
I mean, I agree, but
how do you do
honestly,
it? How do you do it? Sorry.
It's not how do you do it, it's how can you afford to do it when you're in such economic strife.
Yep.
The Egyptian currency has been devaluating nearly almost every day. Like I woke up today, they lost almost 0.4.
Right. Really.
So that really poses also another dilemma.
It does, and you need a real long-term plan. mean, this is not something you're going to do in 5 years. You need a 50-year plan that will, and think, you've got to think about almost every sector of your economy and how you make it more water secure as you work through this.
And also, I don't know, I feel like another important question is it even possible to reach a deal in the first place when you have an authoritarian government? Is that even...
That's a really good
really
question,
tricky. Yeah.
right? And if you're negotiating with someone, so you and I are negotiating with each other, but you have a reputation, sorry, I'm not picking on you, but let's say you've got a reputation of not abiding by your agreements, that I'm happy to agree to anything, I'm just not going to do it. And if that gets me what I want to do, that's a real problem. And this is why I think one of the sticking issues is enforcement. Is that, look, if I sign an agreement with you and you and I still, you don't do what you're supposed to do, where can I go to get, first of all, somebody to say that I'm right or you're right, somebody to decide who's right. And then if we do that, who's going to enforce this? How's that going to happen? That's a real problem with all these transboundary agreements. It's a real difficult thing to overcome.
What about the process itself? Because if it's only one man on top calling the shots, there isn't going to be any accountability, there isn't going to be any transparency. So I feel like that affects the process in the first place. Because you could get a bad deal, and then
it does.
What are you going to do about it? Nothing.
Right. Well, it does argue that, often when we talk about these kinds of problems, this is why we want to engage other stakeholders in the process. We want to make sure that that civil society has a role in these negotiations and these discussions. We want to ensure that all the other stakeholders who are part of this have a role and a voice in these discussions. Because at the end of the day, these agreements are only as good as the will of the parties to implement them. And that will is going to be dependent upon what they felt about the process, and was the process fair, was it transparent, did we get the things that we wanted to get, does the agreement benefit me? If those things aren't there, then it doesn't work. And so I don't think that, if a single leader is agreeing to something for other reasons and it's not benefit, I think that's not a recipe for success. And so, for example, Sudan, who recently came out and said, look, we completely support this. I suspect that there are a lot of farmers in Sudan who are going to be very curious about that. What does that really mean? You support, what did you support? And what does that mean for us in terms of the water that we're going to get, the timing of the water that we're going to get for our recession agriculture, for our future? What does that really mean? And the government's going to have to answer those questions. Ideally, especially if we're all achieve the vision that we want, which is a democratic Sudan, and they're accountable to their people, then where's that accountability going to happen in this particular issue? And so that's a tough one. And that's true for all the governments, right? At the end of the day, these governments should be, you'd like to think, and I know that's not the case all the time, and maybe not the case today, but you'd want these governments to be accountable to their people. And you want an agreement in place that the people themselves can live with and support.
And realistically, where do you see, where do you think this is all going? Like, how do you think it'll end up?
How it's going to end up?
Probably. Realistically, no emotional.
No emotional. I mean, I look, obviously I know where I want it to end up, right? I've dedicated a large part of my career and life to working with these partners. And I'll also say this, that I have a great deal of respect for my Egyptian, Ethiopian, Sudanese colleagues who I've worked with for decades on these sets of issues. And that's, one thing that a lot of people don't see is how many very committed civil servants, representatives of your different governments who are working on this issue, who are very committed to trying to get a good solution. And that's true on all sides. And it's something that, it gives me a little bit of sense of hope that we'll be able to get there. Again, the problem is that this is happening in a very politically complex region of the world. And we can talk probably for another hour, if not more, about some of these issues. But not only do we have the relationships between Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan. We have their individual relationships with other external partners and countries, either within the GCC or with Russia or with China or with the United States that might be impacting these relationships. We know that there's a dynamic going on with Eritrea and Somalia, and all these countries are playing roles in each other. The security of the Red Sea is an very important issue, and that's playing into this. And so what's going on in Yemen and how the GCC is responding to some of these issues. There's a lot going on in this region that I don't think we see, and it may be. And if we're really lucky, because I do believe that if Egypt and Ethiopia were working together, they could solve this problem that we've all been focused on in the Horn of Africa. This idea of perennial droughts and famines and large humanitarian assistance and conflict and everything else. I do think if Egypt and Ethiopia were working together, they could transform the Horn of Africa. And I firmly believe that. I don't know if all the external partners want Egypt and Ethiopia working together. And that's a bigger question, and that's a problem. If we have outside actors who are engaging in ways that are undermining the capacity of these countries to be able to talk to each other and productively reach an agreement, that's a real problem. That's disconcerting.
Could you elaborate on that, if you can?
Yeah, I think we've seen, not necessarily in this region, but in many places throughout the world where you've got parties talking to each other, but you've got a third party that's not going to benefit from these two parties working together collaboratively. And you'll see them engaging in ways, diplomatically, politically, covertly, in ways to influence those relationships and to change the dynamic, right? Mis and disinformation campaigns, right? We see this here in the United States, where we've got outside actors who are trying to influence elections in the United States. Now, we're not sure exactly why. Maybe they just want to see general instability within the United States. Maybe they want to see one president in power versus another, and so they're coming in to influence those elections. This idea that you can use information now and disinformation to influence how people feel about things that can change the way countries are engaging with each other, that's a different world. And so the capability of other countries to now mess with these kinds of dynamics. I mean, if we took Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and locked them in a room by themselves with no external influence, would they come out with an agreement? Maybe. But with all those other external factors and things, it could be very difficult. I mean, I find it very hard to know what's real. What's true, what isn't. What about, was this report a proper report that came from a legitimate news agency, or was it something issued by somebody else in a blog or somewhere where they were supported by some hidden faction of somebody? It's really hard to see what's true. And this is, look, I don't envy the publics in Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan trying to understand this dam situation. Right? First, it's complicated, right? The whole issue of the water and how much water should everybody get, and what does it really matter? And there's a lot of papers being published, some of which are not credible, saying that, if this is, while this is being filled, Egypt's going to suffer 20% or 30% loss to its economy, because of this and stuff like that. And some of these things are just not justified. But it's hard. How do you, as an individual reader, look at some of that stuff and say, okay, that's not true. So what is true, what isn't true? It's really, really difficult in situations like this. So I don't envy the countries trying to negotiate a solution in this kind of an environment. It's not easy. And this is where I think once we start to see the operations and we start to develop a comfort level with what's going on, right, that Ethiopia is not holding water, right? They're not sending it into space. They're not doing anything else with it. It's getting released because they want to produce power, and that's going to build up a level of confidence, not necessarily trust, but confidence that this is the way it's going to work, and the expectation of how it's going to work, and that we might get to a steady state way of working together that the countries can live with. I mean, I do think 20 years from now, I think we're going to have a commission I think the countries are going to have a formal process. I think they're going to be sitting down regularly and talking to each other and sharing data, looking at the remote sensing data, looking at what the next 6 months forecast looks like, working together to figure out how they can manage that water then to increase both the revenue generated from the dam and agricultural potential. I think it's all going to get there in 20 years. Mostly because a lot of us old people will be gone, and I've got a lot more confidence in, I think, the younger generation than I do in us.
So 2045?
It might be. But transboundary agreements can take that long. It can take that long. And we've seen, cooperative mechanisms take a decade or two to really develop.
I mean, as much as this sounds optimistic, I worry about what's going to happen till we get there.
Well, we keep our fingers crossed that we don't experience a long-term drought. And that if we do experience a long-term drought, that actually brings to light some of these concerns and challenges in a way that gets them resolved.
And can you know in advance when a drought is going to approach?
You can get a sense, right? So, usually we do long-term forecasting based on the ocean temperatures or the Indian Ocean. And there's different cycles that we often talk about. And you might have heard of, the La Nina and those cycles, can help us get a general understanding of what precipitation trends might look like. We are getting better at doing longer term forecasts, knowing what's going to happen 6 months from now. I think with this basin, we generally do because it's not monsoonal, but it's very seasonal, and we know when the wet season is. We can often do a reasonable forecast of what that wet season will look like about 6 months in advance. And as we get closer, it gets better and better, of course. So yeah, you can begin to do, and you can start to see some trends that might allow you to forecast a couple of years out. But that's, it gets risky. But look, there are a lot of things you'd look at, soil moisture, right? Look, if you've had three good years and the soil has a lot of moisture retained in it, then a year of drought, okay, we can deal with it, everybody will be fine. 2 years of drought, things get a little bit harder. 3 years of drought get a little bit more difficult. Again, it's that 5 years of drought. And again, it depends on the commitments that Ethiopia makes for producing power. If Ethiopia has made commitments that are non-negotiable about power production, and it ties their hands about how they operate the dam, that creates a real challenge in terms of, that refilling period. Because they're going to want that water to refill their dam. Again, it's going to get released. It's going to happen. But if that dam drops 20 to 30 billion cubic meters of water, and it takes 2 years to refill that refilling period will continue to propagate those drought conditions downstream for a longer period of time. And that's a problem.
When was the last time there was a drought?
I think a drought. I think there was one. I don't remember, but I do remember there was a period, a prolonged drought, more than 5 years, and I don't remember if that was in the 70s or the 50s, one or the other. But it has happened in the last 100 years, and so that's the time period that people point to say, look, we need to be concerned about this type of thing happening. With climate change, all bets are kind of off. We're just not sure what that means, especially for this region. But fingers crossed that we make it through the next 10 to 15 to 20 years without that, so that we can achieve kind of the steady state, and that ideally relationships have improved, that Ethiopia has now developed in a different way, Egypt is now developing in a different way, Sudan is on a better track, and then the countries are more resilient to these types of things, and we're okay. And then we can better deal with a drought that hits the region. Otherwise, look, it'll be a major problem if that drought happened next year. Not only, then, what would what would the Sudanese public be saying to the Sudanese government, who's agreeing to everything about the dam, if the dam were now used in a way that would keep water from getting to Sudan? So that would be problematic.
So that's really important question. What if a drought takes place without having there been a legal binding agreement in place? What would it look like? I mean, it looks like it's going to look very dark. I don't see any other.
Again, it really depends, right? You don't need an agreement for people to behave well and to be good members of the global community, right? And so you don't need an agreement for Ethiopia to sit down with the other countries during an extreme drought and say, okay, what can we do better to help you guys get through this? That doesn't need an agreement. I appreciate that you might be thinking, but if we don't have an agreement, what compels them to do this? And you're right? There's nothing else outside of their interest in being a good neighbor and being part of that neighborhood, and that they would have an interest in making sure Sudan and Egypt were able to continue to survive and thrive. If they don't have that interest, if they would rather see Sudan and Egypt dry up into dust, then yeah, they could probably do things that could contribute to that. Not a ton, right? Because again, they have to release the water to produce power. As long as they want to produce power, and that's what the dam's designed to do, and they need the power, so as long as they want to produce power, they have to release the water. Again, it only happens if there's that drought and it creates that challenge.
So just to put things into perspective, so how exactly is the dam harmful to other countries down the stream?
Yeah, dams generally can be harmful for a number of reasons, right? So one is they can affect the quality and the quantity of the water that flows downstream, right? So quantity, you might, again, they can extract water. Once you've got the water dammed, they may decide, okay, we can divert it over here and we can grow food from that. There may be evaporative losses as well. This particular case, the evaporative losses are relatively modest compared to what they are further downstream. So that's a benefit in this particular case. When you release water from a dam, the timing might impact, both the timing and the quality of the water might impact the environment downstream. So if you've got fish population that live, Nile perch and other things dependent on that water, depending on how you release the water may be too cold, it may be too warm, it might not be matched to the particular season. The flow rates it may be that the fish respond to changing flow regimes in the river to know when to breed and things like that. If those things change, you could affect then the fish populations in the river. Sedimentation, I think, will improve, and this is a plus. But what that means is that, coming from the mountains, you've got the water, but the water also brings debris and sand and dirt from the mountains with it. All that's going to get trapped behind the dam, and it's not going to go further downstream. And so that'll actually extend the lifespan of some of the dams downstream, because you can imagine running that sand through your turbines and the filling up of your dam. Both those things can reduce the lifespan of your dam. And so Rosaries and some of the other dams out in Sudan, they may be able to last longer and produce more power because of the way the dam's being managed. So it's a trade-off. It's really the timing of those flows downstream that are going to be important, and the quantity, how much water gets released.
And what's the lifespan of the GERD?
That's a really good question. I don't think we've ever taken a large dam out anywhere in the world. We've taken some small dams out and maybe some medium dams, but no large dams. And so it's possible that this dam is there for a very, very long time. And that's the challenge with these large dams. The other benefit, dams are batteries, and Ethiopia does have a lot of renewable energy potential, wind and solar, and often dams can be a good way of storing energy and storing power. This dam really isn't designed for that as much, but having dams as part of your overall power mix is an important thing, and so look, there's an important dam for Ethiopia, no question about it. Was it the right dam to build at this particular point in time? I have questions about that. I would have started upstream, because if you want to build a cascade of dams, you want to build the dam at the top before you build the dam at the bottom. So that way when you fill this dam, you're not taking water away from this dam. So you want to build this one, then build this one, then build this one, and then build the end dam, but they built the end dam. And so that raises, that's probably not the way I would have gone about it, but I appreciate the fact they needed a big dam and they needed a lot of power to produce. But I also worry about the power markets. I'm concerned that the dam doesn't generate the revenue that Ethiopia needs to continue to sustain the dam. It's an expensive project. I think it was originally proposed at $5 billion. I suspect it'll be $6 to $7 billion at the end of the day. And you need to recover those fees, and you need to pay back, so to speak, how the dam was built. And so who's going to pay for power? And do they have enough customers within the East Africa power pool in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Kenya, and Somalia, paying customers who can actually help recover the costs of the dam? That's going to be important. Egypt could help. Egypt could buy power from the dam, be a customer. If Egypt buys power from the dam, it might increase its say in how the dam is operated. That's a possibility. There's a lot of cooperative things that could be done. They could get an insurance product. The countries could either work collectively or independently to get insurance products so that if there is a major drought, that they're compensated in some way, shape, or form. Right? That would be a novel idea. We've seen this in a couple of other places. We're seeing the growth of climate insurance, but you could imagine if there's a long-term drought and Ethiopia is concerned that it would have to release that first set of water back downstream to meet the needs of the other countries, then maybe Ethiopia should have an insurance plan that enables them to get compensated for the losses of energy production. Maybe Sudan and Egypt has a plan that compensates them for losses in agricultural production for some sort of extreme hydrologic event, a long-term drought. Maybe that's an option. It's complicated.
Yeah, very.
I do, and this is one of the reasons why I did the work that I did in the Department of State. I mean, I really believe that water can be a source of cooperation between countries, and that you can help to use water as a tool to strengthen regional integration, to strengthen economic development and growth, and to build relationships between countries that might not otherwise exist. And dams, pardon the pun, are kind of a great way to cement cooperation, right? If you get an agreement over a dam and that dam is there for 500 years, well, all of a sudden these countries are bound to each other for 500 years. And that's not a bad thing from a peace and security perspective. And so I think it still should be the goal for all of us to achieve some sort of cooperative agreement between these countries. But absent that, we'd like to see Ethiopia manage this dam in a way that's conscious of the downstream impacts to Sudan and Egypt. And I think if they don't, I do think there will be repercussions. And that might not be a military action, but I think there'd be other, when you're not working to support your neighbors, that can come back to you.
Any other closing remarks?
Closing remarks.
I think you wanted to reflect on the recent statement put out by Sudan 3 days ago.
Yeah, again, I think that it's interesting, and maybe it's a positive development because you'd like to think that Sudan was having conversations with Egypt. I'm not sure how many folks are aware, but there is a bilateral agreement that exists between Egypt and Sudan over water, and that part of that agreement says that Egypt and Sudan will work together to solve disputes with the other riparian countries on Nile issues. And so you'd like to think that there were conversations that were going on, but I did notice that Egypt wasn't mentioned in any of the statements that I think Sudan made about the dam, and that's a little troubling. And it's troubling from Sudan's perspective, I think. I mean, Sudan's the one that needs to be concerned about safety issues with the dam, about the day-to-day operations of the dam. And so when they say they're all good to go, I hope that means that there's a close relationship between them and Ethiopia about how this dam gets operated. And if that's the case, it may be that Sudan will protect Egypt's interests in those relationships because Sudan needs the water just as badly as Egypt will. And remember, according to the treaty that exists between Egypt and Sudan, if the flows get reduced by Ethiopia, that's divided among Egypt and Ethiopia, not not in a ratio. So it's not that, because right now, remember, according to the treaty, Egypt gets 55 billion cubic meters of water, Sudan gets 18.5 billion cubic meters of water. So there's a big difference between those two. If there's a loss, it doesn't get divided proportionally between, if 10 billion cubic meters of water gets reduced, Sudan reduces by 5, Egypt reduces by 5. Sudan is more impacted by any losses or any reduction in flows from this system than Egypt would be. And so I suspect, Sudan has to think very carefully about this agreement and what they're doing. That said, the constellation of parties, because I did see that part of that process that evidently the United States, UAE, a couple of others, the African Union were involved in that process. And so it may be that this is tied to a broader set of discussions which may lead us, hopefully, to a cooperative solution. It may be that we're on the verge of a regional agreement, which would be great to see.
I hope that's the case. And if that happens, we'll be speaking soon.
Yeah, no, I hope that's the case. And I hope we are speaking soon about that and that we see it. But more importantly, I hope that there's more conversations going on within Egypt about water. Look, at the end of the day, Egypt is going to be, it already is, you already are one of the most water scarce countries in the world. And they need to take some dramatic steps to achieve their water security. Sudan can feed much of Africa. There's great agricultural potential. Ethiopia can produce power. And so you'd like to think that working together, these three countries can transform that region, and they can. But it's going to take some steps, and they're going to have to work together to do it. I hope we've got the right set of political leaders to get there. But that's going to be the real issue. Whether or not the parties, whether or not the political leadership are willing to sit down and have serious conversations about how they can work collectively for the benefit of the Horn of Africa. And I think they can do it. I think the opportunity is there. I just wonder if they will do it. I can only hope.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking.
No, my pleasure, and I hope we get to talk again if the situation changes. I'm happy to do a version 2.
Hopefully for the better.
Hopefully for the better.